Give you just one more minute to answer the poll questions. Okay, let's get started. Let's see. I wanted to share the results and hopefully you can see my screen. And as people trickle in, we'll get a better sense for who's here. We have people joining us from all over, which is really nice. Excellent. Okay, well, let's get started. Good evening and welcome. I'm so glad that you all are here. My name is Sinead Young and you are in part 2 of the Black Body in the Public Eye. So this is a course that's being sponsored by the Morehouse College Public Health Science Institute and the Andrew Young Center for Global Leadership at Morehouse, in collaboration with Coffee Bluff Pictures. So for those who are with us last week, welcome back. And to those who are just joining us, we welcome you. My name is Sinead Young, and I'm the Danforth Endowed Professor of Psychology at Morehouse College, and it is my pleasure to be your facilitator throughout our journey together. Last week, we heard from faculty who talked to us about a lot of very intriguing topics, and just from the chat box alone, the questions were wonderful. And so we heard presentations on African resistance to German imperialism. We heard presentations on the Black body in early America, and also media portrayals of elite Black athletes, in addition to an excellent roundtable discussion. So not to be outdone by last week, we have an even better program for you. So we're glad that you're here. So this week, we're gonna take a little bit of a deeper dive into race science. We're gonna talk about women in sports. And we're also going to once again revisit the media and specifically talk about the Black press. This is an occasion that we get to once again evoke the names of some of the 18 Black athletes who competed in the 1936 Olympics in Nazi Germany. And for those who are not Morehouse students, for our guests who are non-Morehouse students, we want to give you a little taste of what it is to be a Morehouse student. So before we get started, for those who are unfamiliar with the mission of Morehouse, our mission is to educate our students on the history and culture of Black people. In that vein is Sankofa, which is an Akan principle, which literally means go back and get it. So in Olympic Pride, American Prejudice, in the book and the documentary, we learn the story of a Ralph Metcalfe, who was an Olympian. He was a World War II veteran. He was a US representative. And he was also one of the co-founders of the Congressional Black Caucus. And for those who have not yet heard his name, you will not forget him. Because in 1977, he introduced the House Joint Resolution designating February as Black History Month. So he was building on the work of Carter G. Woodson. And so in that vein, we are going back to our history and we're using it to understand where we are today and how we can move forward. As we think about Black Lives Mattering and as we affirm Black Lives Mattering, we must understand that racial violence of Black men has traditionally been centered. What I mean by that is that for some people, they were surprised when they saw the video of Brittany Gilliam and her daughters and nieces who were aged 6 to 17, handcuffed on the ground in Aurora, Colorado. As Morehouse College faculty member Stephanie Dunn, who we heard from last week, writes, "Why is racial violence against Black men the preeminent de facto public representation? In large part, it's because the gendering of the Black freedom struggle historically privileges physical, social, and political assaults on Black manhood as the ultimate denial of personhood and freedom, placing Black men's oppression at the center of public discourse about racial violence." In 2014, the African American Policy Forum launched the Say Her Name campaign, which brings awareness to the often invisible names and stories of Black women and girls who have been victimized by police violence. Say Her Name is an extension of the work that's been done by Kimberly Crenshaw, who has written extensively about the concept of intersectionality. Intersectionality being how race, class, and gender intersect or interlocked to create unique systems of oppression. One of the themes of this course is how sports mirror society and what is happening in society. But the inverse is also true. Sports and sports figures in particular can inspire and impact society. So just this week, we saw multiple WNBA players from various teams standing in solidarity for the Black Lives Matter movement and refusing to be silenced. So it was 48 years ago that the Title IX federal civil rights law was passed as part of the Education Amendment of 1972. This law protects people from discrimination based on sex in education programs or anywhere that receives federal funding. Most of us know Title IX for various reasons, including sexual misconduct. But Title IX, the greatest impact it's also had has been the exponential growth of girls and women in sports. Before 1972, 1 in 27 girls played a sport. Today, that number is 1 in 3. Long before Title IX, there was Tidie Pickett and Louise Stokes, whose stories you're going to learn more about today, and who had to overcome intersecting oppressions of sexism, racism, and classism to become the elite athletes that they were. So today, in part 2, we practice the principles of Sankofa, where we are going back to get the history that will inform how we conduct ourselves today, how we address many of these social issues and injustices happening now, and the future that we want to build together. So with that, I want to turn it over to our collaborator from Coffee Bluff Pictures, writer and director extraordinaire, Ms. Deborah Riley Draper.
Thank you, Dr. Young. What an honor to be here. You always do such a great job of setting the table, and this is an amazing table that we get to eat from. As a filmmaker and as a creative, our work at Coffee Bluff Pictures is to shed light on the intentional or unintentional stories that are left out of the dominant narrative, left out of the canon, left out of the film and literature. This story for us was not the story we initially wanted to tell. We initially wanted to tell a story of the Black woman who was interned in the Nazi concentration camp, Beleda Snow, the trumpet player from Chattanooga, Tennessee. And in an article in the Amsterdam News, she mentioned the 18 African-American athletes that were in Berlin in 1936. I was floored. I didn't know there were 18 African-Americans in Nazi Germany in 1936. My history had only shone light on Jesse Owens. But as it turned out, 18 African-Americans defied Hitler and Jim Crow to win hearts and medals in Berlin. 16 men, which included Archie Williams, who would become a Tuskegee Airman, Ralph Metcalf, who would become a congressman, and Mac Robinson, who was born on a plantation like the Robinsons before him and who would be the big brother to Jackie Robinson, and 2 women, Tidie Pickett and Louise Stokes. These stories are untold. These stories are hidden, and it's our job as storytellers to make sure that we understand our history so that we can transfer that knowledge to the next generation as a blueprint for how we live now and how we live in the future. But also to illustrate the debt and the sacrifice that's already been paid. Thank you, Morehouse College. Thank you to all of the amazing scholars who've made this an incredible experience for me and my team. Back to you, Dr. Young. And you might be on mute.
And I am. I wanted to share this collage of photographs of Ralph Metcalfe, who I referenced in my introduction. And you're going to learn a bit more about his extraordinary story. And at one point, he was deemed the fastest man alive, the world's fastest human. And so we're really honored to have his grandson, Nasser, with us this evening on our roundtable, in addition to our other excellent roundtable guests who you're going to hear about. But again, for those who are just joining us for the first time, I offer you a warm welcome from Atlanta, and we're so pleased that you're here. So let me tell you how we're going to run this evening. So, you know, like any good course that you may have taken, we have some objectives for you that we'd like you to walk away with. So the first one being to describe the social historical basis of institutional racism as represented in sports and the intersection of theories of scientific racism as they relate to Black bodies through public policy, advertising, and media. We also will be analyzing the role of race science in sports and modern policing, and the use of intersectionality framework, include race and gender specifically, to examine how women are viewed in sports. So I know that many of you are Zoom experts at this point, and so we do appreciate you joining us on yet another Zoom. Because this is a webinar, someone asked me last week, we cannot see you, the audience members, so thank you for dressing up for us. I'm sure you look wonderful. But if you have a question, we're gonna ask that you put it in the Q&A box, and that way we'll be able to answer questions throughout. For those who are so inclined to engage in social media, we're asking that you use the hashtags of Morehouse Black Bodies and the Olympic Pride American Prejudice hashtag. And that way we can interact with you as well on social media. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube, and we will share more information with you about the recordings. Many of the faculty will be sharing their slides with you, so for those who would like to do a little bit more studying. And we also will have a bibliography as well. So you're gonna hear folks talk about different books or different journal articles that they've referenced. So we will compile that information. If you have any questions, you are welcome to email info@coffeebluffpictures.com. We have an exciting lineup for you. So we have these Morehouse College faculty who have, you know, taken so much time and read multiple books and would love to give you an hour-long presentation, but in the interest of time, we will just give you a taste of what we hope will be a longer course in the future. So we have Dr. Wallace Sharif, who is a professor in the Department of Biology at Morehouse. And also he is the principal of the Molecular Biomarkers of Anxiety, Stress, and Aging, or MBASA lab. We have Dr. Maya Cornet, who is the Associate Director of Experimental Education with the Andrew Young Center for Global Leadership. And we have Professor Mickey Harris, who is the Senior Assistant Professor of Journalism and Sports Communications Studies. We will follow our faculty presentations by a Q&A, followed by a roundtable discussion. And once again, we're really excited to have this lineup. So the roundtable will be moderated by Deborah Riley Draper. And we are fortunate to have Miss Renee Montgomery, who is a WNBA player with the Atlanta Dream. We have Miss Ednisha Curry, who's an assistant coach with the Maine Black Bears, and Mr. Nasser Metcalfe, who is an actor and a writer and the grandson of Ralph Metcalfe. So what a lineup we have for you. And so I'm actually going to turn it over to you, Deborah.
Thank you so much. It is time for the scholarly portion of this mini course. Before I tee it off to Dr. Sharif, I want to talk a little bit about American eugenics. American eugenics influenced Nazi Germany. The idea of eugenics goes back to Plato, but in America, we really started to double down on it in the late 1800s and the early 1900s because we were interested in selective breeding. We wanted to understand who had good genes and who didn't, who was fit and who was unfit. So this idea of sterilization, in which in America we sterilized over 64,000 people during that American eugenics era. And that sterilization program informed the Nuremberg laws in Nazi Germany, those 1935 laws that were about racial hygiene. All of this came to this idea of who could best represent humankind. So Fitter Families right here in Georgia was a competition. African Americans were not allowed to compete because the Fitter Families competition in Georgia and its state fairs across America looked to see who was the most attractive, who was the best, and who represented the very, very best in breeding. We'll learn a little bit more about the biology of race science and the fallacy of racialized science with Dr. Sharif. Dr. Sharif, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of race science. I'll say a very good read on this topic is Superior, The Return of Race Science by Angela Sinai. And she framed her work with this quote: "So science is always shaped by the time and the place it is carried out in. And ultimately, it is at the mercy of the personal political beliefs of those carrying it out." And we see that throughout history, that race science in particular is shaped by the prejudices of the people who are engaging in it, whether that's European colonialism or Nazi Germany and the rise of the Aryan race, or even in today's age, in looking at some of the political implications that occur there. So I'm going to frame this in terms of kind of early race science. And pre-Darwin, much of this was simply trying to ascribe the differences in the human race. And this is a classic image by Johann Blumenbach from 1795, which organized, in this case, 5 different racial groups according to the shapes of their skull. And so here, a Chinese skull is on the far left at one extreme, and a Ethiopian skull is at the far right at another extreme. Now here, as was typical for European science, they placed the European skull in the center of this spectrum. And most of the descriptions of race science in those times were putting Europe at the center of the civilization and the Europe white body at the center or the pinnacle of the racial hierarchy. Now, Darwin in 1850, his ideas of natural selection changed a lot of how they thought about race. And it was actually a confluence of many things. It was his kind of his Darwinian survival of the fittest ideas. There was the advent and the need to justify European colonialism and the exploitation of the indigenous populations that Europeans engaged in, and to some degree, justification of the transatlantic slave trade, that all gave rise to what was a eugenic movement. And so eugenics, as shown from this image in 1932, was the idea that humans could dictate human evolution. So it's a self-direction of human evolution. It was the idea of using all that we knew in the sciences in order to create a superior person. And it had 2 major tenets. One was to increase the reproduction of what is considered the superior stock or the elites. And the other is to decrease the reproduction of the quote unquote inferior people, whether that be by race or by other mental disorder or whatever factors that they were viewing. And it's with eugenics and this idea that you could create a master race, that you really saw a change in the description of how we describe the other races to really show that the European ideal, and that's shown in this, phrenology image here, that looks at the shape of skulls, as the superior race and all others following at some place underneath that. And as Fred Knight brought up last week in his talk, you actually saw here in America a shift from the description of the Black body from one of highlighting its strength, or as he put it, its lusty qualities, to that highlights the weaknesses of the Black body and the deficiencies in the Black body. So the eugenic movement was born in Europe, as Deborah referred to, but it really flourished in the US. It was a common accepted academic program, and it was in the US that we first codified some of these eugenic principles. And as Deborah referred to, we had the forced sterilization of 64,000 people as legal in the US. And it is this American form of eugenics that inspired Hitler and formed the foundation of his methodology to form the master Aryan race in his Nazi Germany at the time in which our Olympians went over there. And so he really was inspired. He actually wrote letters to US eugenics, talking about how much he enjoyed that work. And here's an image of an Aryan that is measuring the nose of a German to determine whether that person was sufficiently Aryan or whether he was Jewish or not. And it was the world viewing what in many ways is the natural conclusions to eugenics in terms of the medical experimentation, the forced sterilization. In Germany, there were over 40,000 people who were sterilized, including Black Germans, Jews, and Gypsies. So when the world saw that, they were horrified by the results, and it really caused the death of eugenics as a scholarly program and endeavor. At that point in 1940, the prevailing logic was that there were so few differences between the races that none of them are biologically meaningful, and that we are all one species and one human race. Eugenics work continued, but it did so under the auspices of population differences and human diversity, as opposed to explicitly eugenic science or race science. And this continued to this day. And in fact, it's found powerful new tools in the technology that we have now. Now, I am a geneticist and a cellular biologist, so I appreciate this technology. I appreciate the power of technology, but it can be misused, again, to serve the political purposes of those who seek to abuse this. And so we have now the capacity to give exquisite amounts of details and the differences between people and the similarities between people. We can now, for $1,000, capture every base in the human body and compare that to thousands of other people. And what that has shown is that we are, in fact, much more closely related to each other than we originally thought. And in fact, there's more genetic diversity within racial groups or population groups than there are between population groups. So all of these things that have been said since 1940 are true. But we also have the capacity to highlight and zero in on those differences between these peoples. And so this is my own genetics. I got this for $100 from 23andMe. And you can measure down to the chromosome level exactly what portions of your ancestry are derived from African ancestry or from wherever, European ancestry. For me, like many African Americans, I am a mix of European ancestry in the blue and African ancestry in the red. And we can see this has some interesting effects. This is a study from article from 2017, in which a white cop got one of these analyses, He told his coworkers that he was 18% African, and he ended up suing the station for discrimination because of the harassment he experienced simply from his colleagues from the results of this test. Now we can learn a lot about even events in the past through current day genetics. And there's a fascinating paper that just came out last month, The Genetic Consequences of the Transatlantic Slave Trade in the Americas. And one of the findings was that maternal African DNA in African Americans outweighs paternal or male African DNA by a ratio of 2-to-1 in the US and by a ratio of 17-to-1 in Southern America. And within our DNA right now, we have the legacy of slavery in terms of the rate of enslaved women as a systemic program, particularly in South America and even in the US. And this type of information can be misused, particularly in terms of intelligence research. This is James Watson, who, along with Francis Crick and Rosalind Franklin, discovered the structure of DNA in 2007. He was on the record with this quote, "I'm inherently gloomy about the prospect of Africa because all of our social policies are based on the fact that their intelligence is the same as ours, whereas all of our testing says not really." Now, this is clearly a false racist sentiment, but it's one that's born by misinterpretation of the genetic data and the intelligence data that is out there. And it is one that is shared by many people. And this has profound policy implications. If you believe that intelligence is biological and genetic, then that means that you have no reason as a politician to seek an equitable and just society, because you can have something that explains away the differences that you see in populations in an area. So this is a dangerous sentiment, one that can be misinterpreted. And in fact, there have been studies that have shown some of these things by the wrong people. So I will end with this. Obviously, racial bias in the US is not gone. We are talking about the Olympians from 1936, the 18 Olympians from 1936. This is something that's still going on today. This is a study that came out 2 weeks ago looking at football, international football, what we call soccer, from last season, just last year, racial bias in sports, in football commentary, and they just compared dark-skinned football players to light-skinned football players, and what they saw were dark-skinned football players got the majority of the criticism in announcing, light-skins got the majority of the praise. And then when you looked at the nature of the praise as shown here, dark-skinned players were praised for speed, power, and form, so-called power and pace, natural, innate abilities, whereas light-skinned players were praised for work ethic, soccer IQ, leadership, and so-called intellectual abilities. And so this is still going on, and it's still something that needs to be addressed. And so I will end with that, and I'm happy to take any questions and comments.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Sharif. We really appreciate that. That was excellent. And we will be taking more questions as questions come up in the Q&A. I wonder if very briefly you can speak to how the perception of biological, or the fallacy of biological differences, might impact individuals who practice something like medicine. We've heard some of the stories, but could you just speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, you know, so with this sports announcing story, one of the things that they said to combat it was implicit bias. We know in medicine, in particular, that there is still to this day physicians who believe that Black patients have a higher tolerance for pain, and so they are given less medication and things of that nature. Now, this is something, I mean, there are lots of solutions. One is to increase the amount of diversity that's within the medical field or within these fields. That soccer commentary, the announcers are 93% white. And so having more diverse people making these announcements might automatically do that. And you can see this in the medical field as well.
Thank you so much. Okay, so before we get to our next presenter, we wanted to share a brief video with you. I will let you take it away, Deborah.
Absolutely. This is the U.S. Manhattan, the boat that took the 1936 athletes from New York first to Hamburg, then Berlin. 400 American athletes, 18 African American, 16 men, and 2 women, Louise Stokes and Tidie Pickett. And now for a deeper dive into the lives of Tidie Pickett and Louise Stokes as American athletes in Nazi Germany, Dr. Maya Cornet. And I do want to point out that we're very on of Louise Stokes. Wolfie Frazier is here. So thank you for joining us. And now we'll get to talk a little bit about your mom, Louise Stokes, and one of her best friends from her childhood Olympic life, Tidie Pickett. Take it away, Dr. Cornet.
Okay, thank you. So give me 1 second and I will share my screen and we will get started. Most of us will never qualify for the Olympic Games the way Tidie Pickett and Louise Stokes first did in 1932. Most of us will never win 4 Olympic gold medals the way Serena and Venus Williams each have. But we will strive and hopefully achieve excellence in our own endeavors. This excellence may require us to show resilience against unfair treatment, resistance to attempts to control and to silence us, and require us to revolutionize the way things are done in our fields. So today, we are going to examine the lives of Black women who first made it to the world stage as Olympians, but continue to show their brilliance, their innovation as entrepreneurs, as educators, and investors in future generations. So today, we will talk about lessons in resistance, resilience, and revolution from Tidie Pickett, Louise Stokes, and Venus and Serena Williams. So I wanted to start by lifting up Dr. Sinead Young for her work in organizing this event, and Deborah Riley Draper for her work in Olympic Pride, American Prejudice, because they both make sure that we understand that our legacy of excellence is not a single person narrative. The way we many times learn about Black stories and Black history. We might learn about just Harriet Tubman or just Jesse Owens, instead of learning that these were moments of collective excellence where Black people supported each other through struggle and triumph. And so we learn, of course, that the 1936 Olympic Games were the collective that require people to tell the truth about how deeply ingrained oppression was and is in every aspect of our lives. So to tell the story of Tidie Pickett and Louise Stokes, we have to tell the story not just of German racism and religious persecution, but also of American racism and global sexism and the almost unfathomable resilience of 2 Black women, Louise Stokes and Tidie Pickett. Louise Stokes and Tidie Pickett first qualified for the 1932 Olympics in track and field. This was a particularly big deal because women only started to be able to compete in track and field events in the Olympic Games 4 years prior. And then when it came time for Louise Stokes and Tidie Pickett to compete in those 1932 Olympics, they were forced to watch from the sidelines that 4x100 relay team who celebrated their gold medal because they were replaced with 2 white women who had slower qualifying times. When I learned that Pickett and Stokes then trained for the 1936 Olympics, 4 years after experiencing such a harsh injustice, I thought about this question that many psychologists have tried to answer. How do some people demonstrate such resilience, such capacity to recover from obstacles so quickly? The study on the bottom of your screen describes research that found that resilience can be strengthened by being driven by our values, dreaming about our vision for our lives, and staying committed to these goals. So think about your own life and how you can use this commitment to your vision, to your goals, and to your values to get where you'd like to be. Let's talk some more about this idea of resistance. Another part of resistance to oppression is being able to name with honesty and with courage what happened to us. Pickett is quoted as saying, "Prejudice, not slowness, kept her from a medal." Accurately naming prejudice and discrimination prevents the harmful things that happen to us from seeping into our belief system about ourselves. It helps us to remember that prejudice, discrimination, sexism, racism, these things say nothing about those of us experiencing it and everything about the people engaging in it. Similarly, Serena Williams spoke out against the sexism that happened to her when she received some of the harshest penalties we have ever seen in a tennis match for smashing her racket and arguing with a referee in her US Open finals match against Naomi Osaka in 2018. She received several punishments that included loss of a game, a harsher consequence than we have ever seen any white male tennis player who engaged in similar or worse behaviors. Within Serena's resistance to oppression, we see her name the sexism that happened. We also see her take responsibility for her actions and then apologize to Naomi Osaka for changing that moment in history into a story about Serena Williams and not a story about another Black woman's victory, Naomi Osaka. So here, Serena Williams shows us that resistance to oppression is a collective and introspective endeavor, one that requires us to constantly be mindful of the ways that oppression may be operating in our own lives, but to also be honest about the ways that we might be complicit in the harm of others. When Serena Williams experienced life-threatening complications during childbirth and had to insist on greater intervention from her doctors, she shined a light on the experience that many Black women have during childbirth, where they're not trusted to communicate pain or concerns about their bodies. And we know from the study you see described at the bottom of your screen that exposure to racism and similar types of stressors partially explains the higher infant mortality rate that Black women experience. After returning from maternity leave, Serena Williams challenged the policy of top-ranked tennis players losing their ranking and advocated for reform in the troubling maternity leave policies that many women experience. Finally, let's talk about revolution. Revolution for the Williams sisters has meant showing up as their whole selves despite attempts to silence or control them. We saw Venus and Serena show up on the scene with hairstyles that reflected their culture and clothing that reflected their interest in fashion, and also 128-mile-per-hour serves. They received constant criticism about the way they presented their bodies, their hair, that included a ban on an outfit that Serena Williams wore in the French Open that you see there, which she described supported circulation in her legs, a challenge that she was experiencing after difficulties during childbirth. So they were repeatedly told, change the way you present your body so that our viewers are more comfortable. Not, maybe our viewers should change. Maybe they should stop dissecting women's bodies and judging them based on size and shape. Maybe they should learn about how clothing can be a part of cultural expression or can be a part of supporting our health and well-being. But in response to the criticism, they continue to show up as their whole selves, to create their own fashion lines, to present their bodies however they felt confident and comfortable, and encourage other women to feel the same. Finally, revolutionizing spaces can include expanding our vision of ourselves beyond moments and goals to legacy. How will the spaces we enter be different and better because we were there? What is your contribution to your community and building opportunities for others? These are legacy questions. Serena Williams has worked with nonprofit organizations to build schools in Jamaica and 3 African nations. Louise Stokes started a bowling league for Black women. Heidi Pickett spent 23 years as an elementary school principal. I believe we can and are all doing the work to revolutionize the spaces we enter. We enter into spaces and change the way things are done by our choice to bring our whole selves into that space, our cultural selves, our creative selves, our truth telling into those spaces, and they are forever changed. So I will leave you with one question that only you can answer. What does resilience, resistance, and revolution look like in your life? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cornet. That was amazing and excellent. So we really appreciate that. One of the questions that I had for you, and again, we'll open it up for everyone momentarily, is, you know, given that the Williams sisters do so much, what do you think their legacy will be?
I think that they will have this legacy of encouraging women, and in particular, Black women, to stand up and be their authentic self and continue to, regardless of whatever challenges that they experience, to continue to advocate and speak out for that. And then to also just do that investment, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be in these loud ways where there's constantly media attention for it, but that they're investing in building schools, creating new leagues and new opportunities for women to play sports, and that they're doing this regardless of whether there is that recognition for the work or not. And just really making sure that we all see work that needs to get done, and we see that through combined and collective efforts that we can engage in that work.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and we'll have opportunities to speak more about that. Next up, I am so pleased to introduce our next speaker, Professor Mickey Harris, who is a Senior Assistant Professor of Journalism and Sports Communication Studies and co-founder of the Atlanta Drone Lab. Mickey will be speaking to us about a presentation entitled, "With Access Comes Power: The Role of the Black Press in the United States and the Responsibility That Comes with Capturing Images of Black Athletes." And we're so pleased to have Mickey's presentation, and I will turn it over.
a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dr. Young, for the introduction. Participants, panelists, guests, and Ms. Draper, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. There is a headline that ran, "Black athlete star in front of Hitler at the Berlin Games." And with that headline, a story and photos ran. If only the dateline of that article was August of 1936. It ran on July 31st, 2020. And you may say, why? Why is that the case? Well, Olympic Pride, American Prejudice, the book and the documentary, let us know that all those athletes and the headline, that did run with respect to the Black press. We covered that. But mainstream press just focused on Jesse Owens. And there was a reason for that. The reason being Jesse Owens versus Hitler was one man against Hitler. Black journalists have traditionally recognized racism as a story in the United States, covering Black athletes and their victories as they represent the U.S. in Berlin meant covering the inequities and racism they faced while here in the United States. I'd like to talk with you about the power of storytelling through the Black press and Black journalists, starting with 1827 through Reconstruction, going into the Civil Rights Movement, and a current day story. Whether you're a Black journalist working for a mainstream press or a Black journalist working for a Black press, there's a balance that has to be struck between the power of the story, the access to the community, and the responsibility not just to report on what is taking place, but why it takes place, how did it come to be, and who are the people from within. The Black press was birthed in 1827 in New York with the Freedom's Journal. And that newspaper, as well as many that came about in the 19th century, were to fight enslavement, show stories of humanity, show us who we were with political and social capital. We also had a number of publications then coming up into the 20th century, and that was throughout Reconstruction, where we needed to be able to see images of who we were and celebrate who we were, to show the success, to show the humanity of us. The Black press challenged its reporters to work by the Negro Press Creed. The Negro Press believes that America can best lead the world away from racial and national antagonisms when it accords every man, regardless of race, color, or creed, his human and equal rights. Hating no man, fearing no man, the Negro Press strives to help every man in the firm belief that all are hurt as long as anyone is held back. Although this quote does not reference women, Ida B. Wells was that rock star journalist who risked her life to be an investigative journalist and report on the lynchings and horrific crimes that were taking place against us. It is in this era that the Berlin Olympics are held. Our papers reported on the 18 athletes, but Southern daily newspapers were not putting the stories of our successes or who we were out there. Southern dailies perpetuated the racist stereotypes of us as Sambo, Jemima, Jezebel, and hypermasculine super predators, so that the killing of us, the lynching of us, and Jim Crow laws were justified. As people were moved to fight against Jim Crow and injustice, the Black press led a movement through its storytelling. And I want to talk now a little bit about that movement through the Civil Rights Movement. Emmett Till's story was covered by the mainstream press as a basic crime story: who, what, when, where. And with that also came this level of respectability, where they discussed his background to justify the killing of this young boy. His brilliant mother made sure that when his body was recovered, it was brought back to Chicago. And in Chicago, she had a funeral, an open casket funeral, and arranged with Jet Magazine, giving them the exclusive rights to photograph him and expose the injustice, the hatred, everything that happened to him through a visual image that went national. That image alone showed racism. It exists. It is a story. It's beyond a story. It's a problem. And the mainstream papers came back to that story and reported on it. And with them reporting on it, their readers, their viewership expressed outrage. We knew racism existed before George Floyd, before Emmett Till. But sometimes it takes the power of the image to be able to stir some things up. The awareness, the acknowledgement of racism beyond the Black press and Black readers, but throughout our country. And now I want to talk about access and move to the Montgomery bus boycotts. The boycotts started December 5th, 1955. There was a flyer calling attention to the boycotts with an image of Claudette Colvin, the 15-year-old girl who refused to give up her seat 9 months prior to the start of the boycott. This was covered by the Black press. And many people would say, wait. I know about Rosa Parks. What about, who's Claudette? Why don't we hear about Claudette? Again, who's reporting the story? Southern dailies did a poor job in reporting. They never spelled people's names right or didn't even know people's names at all. Oftentimes did not acknowledge the leaders and the people within the movement. We're telling stories of them. But this was also because they didn't have access. When public meetings were held, people didn't announce themselves. You had to know them. You had to be inside. And that's what Emory Jackson and the Black press did. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and Newsweek did eventually come in 3 months after the start of the boycott and after Jackson had already been reporting. I now want to talk about perspective. The Black press's perspective had to tell the stories that white reporters did not know about or where they would not go, so that our work could share what was needed for racial equality. And it was at Central High School, where we call the Little Rock Nine. 9 students were attempting to enroll on September 4th, 1957. And all the press, Southern dailies, mainstream, and the Black press were there to cover it. The governor of Alabama had the Arkansas National Guard brought them in to prevent the students' access to the school. Mobs of segregationists swarmed the area. The press came in and they had to confront not just the story, but the mobs of people around the story. White reporters had access to motels, hotels, rooming houses, and restaurants. Black reporters did not. And so the Black reporters stayed in homes with Black people, specifically the Black families who were working to integrate the school. Daisy Bates, she was a journalist and also head of the local NAACP. Her husband was also with the NAACP. And they had their house as central headquarters for the Black press. A number of them stayed there, ate there, and sat in on strategy meetings, were able to interact with lawyers, leaders, the students, and their families. This was a perspective that translated into stories that were much different than what mainstream press and Southern dailies were reporting on. There's this experience of engagement that happens when you have lack of access to what's taking place right at Central High, but you gain the access of the families behind the scenes. It changes the perspective and it changes the story. I'd love to talk and go through the integration of other schools, the lunch counter sit-ins, the freedom rides, the formation of SNCC, the Black Power movement, but that's going to be for another class. 15 years ago, I had an assignment to cover Olympic bobsledder Vanetta Flowers as she was racing in Lake Placid, New York to attempt to qualify for the 2006 Winter Olympic Games in Torino, Italy. I did a quick search to see what was out there on her, and a lot of information was on her gold win with the 2002 Games in Salt Lake City, and also information about her accomplishments as a track athlete from the University of Alabama. Not much else was there. 6 months later, if I had looked, I would have seen that she was ESPN's hottest female athlete. But ESPN wrote on her, and there were the other information online, but not anything about who she was. And so when I went up to Lake Placid, that was something I wanted to find out. I captured Vanetta's training, her photo shoots, and her press briefings, but spent a day with no cameras at all to engage her family. I joined them for meals, and that allowed me access. I established trust, and that was what gave me the access. But with that access came responsibility. I had to protect the image of their children. Specifically Jordan. Their twin sons were born prematurely, and Jordan had been born without auditory nerves, ear canals, and his ears had not been fully formed externally. So what I captured was what I saw and who they were. The twin boys looked up to Vanetta, their mother. She balanced motherhood with sport, and both she and her husband Johnny, they worked tirelessly for their sons. Johnny then shared with me that there was a brain implant surgery that could build Jordan's ears, and there was one doctor in the world who was performing that surgery, and that doctor's office was just outside of Torino, Italy. It was at that moment that the story came to life. This is not a bobsled story of speed and turns on the ice. It's a story about a premier athlete, a woman, a mother, motivated by God and her family. So on race day, Vanetta and her bobsled partner qualified for the Torino Olympic Games. And the next month, the family flew to Italy for Jordan's surgery and Vanetta's Olympic race. My photos of Vanetta ran on the front page of USA Today. There was an inside spread and an online multimedia video. I got feedback from the editors, and they said that I didn't show enough of the bobsledding. But I was okay with that. My purpose in storytelling has a different perspective. And with the access I get and the responsibility I take, I see the power that the Black press and Black journalists have through the stories that we have shown and that we continue to show. Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to speaking with you more about this work.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Harris. That was extremely informative. We really appreciate you. I'm going to ask all of the faculty to turn their cameras on and unmute themselves. And we have our first question that will come from rising senior, political science major, Devin Rector. Devin, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Dr. Young. And as she previously mentioned, my name is Devin Rector, rising senior at Morehouse College, political science major from Los Angeles, California. So my first question is for Dr. Cornet. And the first question goes, if there is political pressure for Black athletes, and you discussed about the resilience and revolution that the Williams sisters established, does that set the bar for Black athletes? And if it does that come with political pressure as applied to the media? We see that a lot of people within the community expect the athletes to play a role in politics. Do you feel that that is added pressure for our athletes?
Thank you. That's a great question. I do think that Black athletes experience tremendous and profound amounts of pressure, both within their sport and also from political agendas, as well as community agendas and capitalist agendas as well. And so I do think that for our athletes, that their mere presence is transformative. And so that however they choose to be active in politics and expressing themselves, that is an additional choice that they take upon themselves. I don't feel like it is necessarily a requirement or an expectation, but I do feel like it is a beautiful thing when we are able to really first study and learn and understand, and then use the platform that many athletes are given to impact change, right? And for some people, that can just mean telling the truth about their lives. Because as a Black woman or as a Black man, if you tell the truth about your life and the things you're going through, that illuminates these larger issues that many people are also experiencing.
Thank you, Dr. Cornet. Mr. Rector, did you have a second question? I heard you ask for the first one.
Yes, I have one more question. Oh, two more questions. I'm sorry. The second question is for Dr. Harris, and you talked about the importance of the Black press, and we see, and you brought a connection between Jet Magazine and the Emmett Till casket, and we see that Jet Magazine's last issue was in 2014. So, could you talk about the importance of not only the Black press, but also the importance of us supporting the Black press so they can maintain that power that you spoke of?
Oh, definitely. As we know, the industry has changed significantly with respect to print products. And so for many of us, Jet Magazine was a staple in our homes. And some of us may have relatives that still have that magazine stacked up in their living rooms today. It's terrible what has happened with respect to the publishing industry. The positive, if we look at the positive aspect though, look at what has emerged with respect to our digital content. And the way that we interact with the press is much different, where not all of us pay to go read. A number of us have formed these circles and communities where information is fed to us. And so what I tell students, many who have never touched a newspaper in their lives or picked up magazines that have come to a home, that it's really important to stay true to what the mission is. And so it's being able to be true to finding who are we and how do we share those stories and how do we support the writers, whatever the platform, who are sharing those stories in authentic ways. And so I think it's a matter of knowing where to look, or also being in touch with and understanding that the content that comes to you may not always be the best content, but it's up to you, the individual, to figure out how do you support it and share it and use social media to be able to promote it.
Great. Last quick question, Mr. Rector.
Okay, and my last question is for Dr. Sharif, and my question is do you believe there's a connection between the history of eugenics and colorism within the African American community?
Well, I don't know necessarily about eugenics, but certainly the colorism is connected to the white supremacy and the biases of the dominant culture of that time. And so, yeah, I'll say that.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Rector. Really appreciate you. A couple of questions that came in via the chat or the Q&A box. And Dr. Sharif, you may be able to speak to this. The question is, when receiving DNA results, why do people think that DNA from Europe denotes white genetics when our people left the motherland, explored and populated regions across the globe? Just look at images of the original Chinese Americans, etc.
Yeah, I could spend another 50 minutes talking about this, but if you look at the origin of modern humans, the genetic diversity is in Africa, so everybody came out of Africa, and then with the migration of these humans to other places, you have what's called genetic drift, or just the winnowing of that total genetic pool. And you can see that in the genetics now. There's a vastly more genetic diversity within populations in Africa than there are within these other populations. So and even when you do these personalized tests, you have to arrange it to go back to a place where it gives you the most diversity. If you go back 10,000 years, it's all going to be from one region, right? And so a lot of these tests only go back maybe 500 or 600 years in terms of your ancestry, because that is otherwise you all end up in the same place.
Absolutely, and a couple of folks in the chat were commenting on companies like 23andMe only able to tell you where your ancestors were about 400 years ago.
Right.
Which is really just a blink in time. Thank you, Cleister Cotton. I hope I'm not butchering your name, for your question. Another question from Sonia Laurie. Would any of these great panelists be able to comment on the shared history of bias in the white mainstream press and white academic publishing, and the white mainstream press at large? How can we apply what we're learning about media messaging to academic work that is in large part generated and shared by white people? And that's to any or all of the panelists. Let's start with you, Professor Harris.
Thank you. I was sitting in a workshop maybe about 18 years ago at the Poynter Institute, which is the think tank for journalism. And the question came up about diversity in newsrooms. And the reality is that the writers who are publishing in academic spaces and also in the mainstream press, it's not going to be a representation of our population. So we're not going to have 15% Black employees at these organizations. And so it really is up to everyone, anyone, no matter what your background is, your ethnic background, to be able to push your writing, your thinking in ways that go beyond your smaller experience. And so for a number of white writers, editors, academic publishers, it's a matter of looking at how do I start looking at life and looking at people from within. What's motivating them? What are those universal motivators of humans? And being able to tap into that with respect to writing. And because a number of people, when they do write or approach stories, there's this block of us and them. And it's hard to get past that us and them block to be able to see people's authentic selves.
Absolutely, absolutely. We've all experienced writer's block in some form or fashion. Dr. Cornet, do you want to speak to that as well?
And I do too, Dr. Young, when she's.
Of course.
Oh, you can go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the things as consumers and as the participants in this course, writing, the journalism is tied to capitalism, is tied to consumerism, is tied to consumption. So part of what we have to establish as all people is demonstrating to publishers, studios, newspaper owners, conglomerates, that we want to see different stories. We want to hear different voices. We want to read different books, because that makes the selling in of manuscripts like Olympic Pride, American Prejudice a little less tough. It makes the writers, the authors, whether they're scholars, academics, or regular people who are writing books, fiction or nonfiction, have an easier path to getting their manuscripts published, having an easier path to getting the stories they want to tell sold, because there's an audience for it. I wish we could say that great academic work and great scholarship can be sold in, regardless of if there's market research, but we need the market research to support those endeavors. So that means we need all of you to make sure that the stories we want to tell, the stories we want to hear, are present and available, because the people who make those decisions know that you demand it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Dr. Cornet, did you want to add to that?
I think what they said is beautiful and important and excellent. And then just to uplift the moment that we're in, where there's so many more technologies and ways to access and connect to audiences. And so to also recognize that we don't necessarily need the mainstream in ways that we used to access and reach our audiences.
Absolutely, absolutely. Dr. Sharif, I don't know if you wanted to also comment on that.
I'm good.
So I have a question for everyone. About 5 years ago or so, Jamil Smith wrote an article. I'm going to post it in the chat, but it was entitled, Videos of Police Killings Are Numbing Us to the Spectacle of Black Death. And as I mentioned, the title of this course is The Black Body in the Public Eye. And some might think of the public eye as the white gaze, as Fanon and other folks, Hooks, and many other folks have talked about it. So, you know, it's rare that we have a biologist, we have a psychologist, and we have a journalist all at the same table to get your reactions and your thoughts about the all of the videos, all of the imagery that we're seeing around Black death. And I'm just curious in the next, just briefly, if you all can comment on that and maybe what it's doing to us.
Can I just, I want to start by saying that this is nothing new, and that we have gazed at the Black body throughout, history. We being kind of Europeans, in the Superior book, they had human zoos of different populations in their quote unquote natural habitat. As Sam Livingston said last week, they just 2 years ago returned 600 skulls of African people from Germany, which was used to do a lot of the phrenology studies that I referred to. So this is a new technology that does the same old thing.
Very true. Very, very true. So, Professor Harris or Dr. Cornet?
I wanted to add that I do feel like this moment of replaying and rebooting images of Black Death through social media, through news, that I think that it is a very trauma-inducing and insensitive to Black people in our lives as an approach to promote awareness. I think that if we're thinking about our well-being and orienting ourselves towards action, that what we should be consuming the most of is the clapback, what we are doing in response to, what we have consistently and persistently done, and that those are the images that we should consume so that we can empower ourselves to remember that those things are constantly happening as well.
Thank you for that.
I think that with the images, I can go right to the Emmett Till image and seeing that as a child. And, it got to the point where it's still difficult to look at, but it connects to so many images that are in front of us today. And so still being able to put things in context, but balance that with where are those positive images. I see that the image of Emmett Till and the image of George Floyd, those were needed. That was necessary. We need to have those images out there because there are many people who don't ever pay attention to what's taking place. And so they may not be for our eyes. Not all of us may need to see them to be reminded of what's taking place. But I think they're necessary. But with that, on top of that, the balance of seeing the images that Maya just described is necessary, the positive spaces as well.
Absolutely. And, I would be remiss, especially as a psychologist, not to mention the shared trauma and re-traumatization that happens with a lot of us. So for those who choose not to view those images, that is okay, but it doesn't decrease the awareness around these topics. So Professor Harris, Dr. Sharif, Dr. Cornet, I want to thank you all for 3 excellent, excellent presentations. It sparked lots of conversation in the chat. I want to also thank Mr. Rector for his wonderful questions, and we're so appreciative. So for those who are just joining us, as mentioned, this will be available via YouTube after the 3rd course. So thank you all very, very much. And we are going to prepare for our roundtable discussion. So this has been just an amazing, we wanted to give you a little taste of the way that we do education at Morehouse. And it's important to understand the disciplines and the scholarship. But we're all students. So someone in the chat box said, they feel bad that they're not so caught up on these things. That's okay. You're here today. We're all students. Those of us who teach are students, and our students also teach us. So do not feel bad about that. So now we are in for another treat. We're going to have a roundtable discussion, and it is going to be moderated by my colleague Deborah Wiley Draper of Coffee Bluff Pictures, who's also the writer and director of Olympic Pride, American Prejudice, as well as Versailles 73, American Runway Revolution, and Illegal Rose. Joining Deborah on the roundtable, we will have Nasser Metcalf, who is an actor, writer, producer, and the grandson of Ralph Metcalf, who we talked about a little bit earlier, and also featured in Olympic Pride, American Prejudice. And Nasser is also a son of Morehouse, a Morehouse man. So we're happy to welcome you back. So Nasser graduated from Morehouse with a degree in theater, and he's appeared in a number of films and on stage, and has been listed on IMDb's prestigious list of 40 up-and-coming actors to look out for. Nasser was also nominated for Best Actor at the prestigious International Television Festival in Los Angeles for his work in Disciplinary Actions. Joining us as well, we have Ednisha Curry, who is a trailblazer. She is the only woman, I'll say it again, she's the only woman coaching NCAA Division I men's basketball at the University of Maine. Ednisha is a former WNBA player who played professional basketball for 8 years, first with the Charlotte Sting, followed by the Phoenix Mercury and Los Angeles Sparks, as well as in the Middle East and in Europe. Ednisha plays multiple roles in the NBA, including serving as a technology instructor for assistant coaches, including the WNBA and the NBA. And this is a program for players who would like to become coaches, much like herself. And just on a personal note, I'm so proud of Ednisha. She was a member of my relay team in high school. So I would also like to introduce, if you have turned on a radio or if you looked at television, you have seen Miss Renee Montgomery. She's been very active, and we're so pleased that she's able to join us today. So Renee Montgomery is a native West Virginian and has completed her 11th season in the WNBA, now playing for the Atlanta Dream, but taking a year off to focus on social justice issues. She was drafted 4th overall for the Minnesota Lynx in 2009 after winning a national championship with the Yukon Huskies. Montgomery has also won 3 state basketball championships during her high school years. She was named as WNBA All-Star in 2012, as well as the WNBA 6th Woman of the Year in 2013. In the 2018 WNBA season, she broke a WNBA league record for the most 3-pointers made in a half. 7 of them. So phenomenal. This past WNBA season, she has reached the 500 mark for 3-pointers, making her 12th on the all-time list. In addition to her WNBA basketball career, Renee has started her own nonprofit, the Renee Montgomery Foundation, RMF, whose mission is to provide fun experiences to youth and families and teach them life lessons, principles learned in sports. And so Renee is also, like I said, philanthropic, and she's also working on commentary and acting. So we have 3 dynamic, 3 amazing people who I think, given the presentations that we just heard, will spark even more discussion. So once again, the chat box Q&A is open for questions. And before I turn it over, I want to share this picture and turn it over to Deborah Riley Draper.
Thank you, Dr. Young. This is, in the words of Dr. Cornet, my clapback photo, right? This is the power of 2 African-American women athletes, Heidi Pickett and Louise Stokes, training in the 1930s aboard the USS Manhattan. So this isn't a picture that was captured and shown around the world, but this is a photo that the Black press captured in the 1930s. And with that, let's bring on our amazing Renee. How are you?
Hello. I feel bad. My computer is not the newest version to have the background. In case people are wondering why I don't have the cool background, my laptop isn't compatible with it, so I'm pretty bummed to be the odd one out right now.
Totally all good. Nasser Metcalf, great to see you. Coach Curry, how are you?
Great to see you too.
Great to be here.
Start with Coach Curry, and when you look at the picture of Heidi Pickett and Louise Stokes, 40 years prior to Title IX, in the 30s, 2 Black women experiencing double jeopardy, race, gender bias. What does that make you think of, and how does that correlate to your current position coaching men's Division I basketball? What's the isolation like? What's that experience for you culturally, as well as professionally?
The first thing that comes to mind is like, dang, we're still here. I'm still the first. It comes with a heavy burden, you know, being the only one. It is an isolation, but it's one that, you know, I'm sure they took with great pride, because if I don't fight and I don't fight to stay in the room, young girls that will come after me won't have the courage and the opportunity. So it comes with that, you know, needed resistance. And I know that I have to continue to fight for this change. But, you know, when I'm thinking about their stories, I'm like, wow, how are we going to really create momentum where we get more opportunities for change? Why is it 40 years later and it's still, we're talking about the only Black woman or the only woman, you know? So that's kind of, you know, the kind of fight that I've taken in, you know, my endeavors in teaching and mentoring other women, you know, getting other women's names out and encouraging them and encouraging other coaches to hire more women, because we're qualified and we deserve to be in those spaces.
Renee Montgomery, in the opening ceremonies of the 1936 Olympics, there were 2 Black women that walked by Adolf Hitler, Heidi Pickett and Louise Stokes. Their mere presence sent a message, a seminal moment in the fight for equality and the fight for civil rights. How do you, back then, 80 plus years ago, to the stand that you're taking now today in 2020?
You know, it's just being empowered. You know, when you feel empowered, you feel like you can do anything. When you're empowered, you feel like you can say anything, especially when you know what you're saying is the right thing, or when you know what you're doing is not something wrong. So I just look at that empowerment that those women had then, and then now just moving forward, you have a Coach Curry, who's the first woman to do it. That's empowerment. That gives empowerment to young girls who maybe want to be a coach, and their particular style, they might want to be a men's coach, you know, men's head basketball coach. Well, now they got Coach Curry, you know. So I think that those things that happened in the past empower moves like mine and right now in the present. I feel empowered. I feel that I can do what I want to do. I can say what I want to say. And so I did. You know, I decided to opt out because I felt that I had that choice, that I could do it, and it's my platform, and I wanted to figure out what to do with myself. And I think that that's just a test of time of how women have become more and more empowered.
In history, we will record that you opted out, Renee Montgomery. That was the position you took. Black history isn't often recorded. It was in 1976 that the Black History Month resolution even passed, and that was because of the tireless work of an Olympian, of a 1932 Olympian, who was also a 1936 Olympian, who became Congressman Ralph Metcalfe. Nasser, that's your grandfather. Talk a little bit about.
I'm sorry, you broke up a little bit there.
What's actually happening when you think about your grandfather and you think about what he did to make Black history not only a part of the calendar, a holiday, but an opportunity to take stories and make them last and make people aware of them, shine light on them, and make them a part of them.
Right. Well, you know, it's interesting because I feel that my grandfather had a long history with regards to his journey as a leader. And it kind of culminated with that singular achievement with regards to Black History Month approximately a year or so prior to his passing. So he never stopped evolving in his leadership journey and never stopped recognizing the opportunities to further his journey as a leader and recognize the needs in our society for expansion of our thoughts and expansion of our ideas. And therefore, previously, we had Negro History Week. So it was an expansion of ideas as a leader that I think helped him to recognize the importance of now having a Black History Month. And essentially because we're arriving at a point in history now where we're once again expanding our ideas about race and our position in society and these issues that we've been fighting for a long time, but there's been that expansion of ideas. So that's one of the things that I admire about him most, is that he never stopped growing in that way. He always embraced the next thing, the next change, the next suitable fight the good fight to fight. And that was, I think, one of the things that inspired him most at the foundational level for making such a gesture and change.
Coach Curry and Renee Montgomery, talk to me a little bit about the role women play in affecting change. And as athletes, are you required? Are you accountable? Are you responsible for using your platform to change not just your life or your sport, but the race as a whole? Is that a responsibility you take or an accountability that you hold dear?
Well, I can just start and say, I always say athletes, they have a choice to do what they want. And I think that's the problem that people are having, in a sense of now athletes are taking that choice and they're choosing to speak out. They're speaking out about social issues. They're speaking about anything they see that they don't like. Athletes are taking this time and they're speaking out, and that's their choice. And there's some athletes who are not speaking out, and that's their choice, So to say that it's somebody's responsibility, yes, an athlete is going to be in a limelight and you expect them to be a certain level of a role model, but man, you have to shout out the ladies of the WNBA. They have taken such a bold stance. So it's not a mandatory thing to take any stance, but the ladies in the WNBA, they've taken a bold stance. They've taken a unified stance, and I think that should be commended. You see the NBA doing the same. They all are locking arms and they're kneeling together. So whether or not it's an athlete's responsibility, I don't know, but it looks like all the athletes feel that it is. You see in the sports, in the basketball world at least, multiple athletes have came out and said that if you don't like that we're kneeling, see you later, bye. They've made it known that this is what we're going to do. So I don't know if it's mandatory. I don't know if it's their responsibility, but the ladies in the WNBA, the NBA, and other athletes across the platforms have just really shown up and shown out for social justice in this climate right now.
Yeah, I agree with Renee. I don't know if it's our responsibility, but I think with the shift in the climate in regards to social justice, I think we all realize how powerful our platform is. And it seems really great because we're all doing it, whether it's coaches, it's the women of the WNBA, the NBA, NCAA, you have all these boards and committees. I think we're all just speaking boldly and loud and without a fear. And, I don't think that's happened before. It's been a couple here and there, but for all of us to kind of seem united for this, it's never happened before. So it does, like Renee, seems like the athletes are kind of being like, okay, we're going to be the leaders for once. And I think that's very powerful because, athletes always struggle with, I want to be seen and known for being more than an athlete. And I think all of us, whether we're former professional athletes or current professional athletes, are kind of taking the lead on this and saying, you know what, I'm going to speak out because I know there's voices that need my voice.
If I may add to that also, I'd like to say that it's interesting when you look at history and look at this time around as we are going through our current struggles and in this time in current time in history. Previously, we always had some singular leader. We had a Dr. King, or we had a Malcolm X, or we had some figure who we embraced, who showed us the way. This time around, we don't seem to have a singular figure in that way, but what we do have are athletes and entertainers and artists who have a platform. And I think that's going to be the difference in the movement this time around. And that's why conversations like this are so important, because who have that type of platform need to understand the responsibility and the power that they really do carry. I mean, just the phrase Black Lives Matter alone, I don't know if everybody really understands the power of the phrase. Now, there are those who may have various opinions about the movement and what the agenda of the movement may or may not be. That's a separate conversation, but the phrase itself, Black Lives Matter, it serves to deconstruct a long history of this socialization and conditioning that we've all been subjected to, that tells us that the value of Black lives, that there's a disparity between the value of Black lives and the value of white lives and other lives. And that's been ingrained in us through mass media arts and so many other forms of subjugation and conditioning. over decades and generations. So the phrase Black Lives Matter, every time it's uttered in the public sphere, in the public conversation, it serves to, brick by brick, sort of dismantle that whole notion. So you have people who are firmly on the other side of this, firmly against the whole agenda and our progress, who have to say that phrase in order to refer to the movement now. They have to speak it. So there's a real power in that. And I commend athletes like yourselves and people who have a platform like yourself for taking that type of stand and recognizing the power in that and continuing to push it forward. So salute to you ladies for that.
You might have a little bit of a short in your mic. I just want to let you know that.
Oh, okay.
Double check your audio.
All right.
And while you do that, I want to talk to Renee Montgomery about the early Olympians. So if you look back at ancient Olympic history, those Olympians were slaves. How do you reconcile in your head, or maybe align or even find similar, the path of those early athletes who have been slaves in ancient Olympia to athletic situations now, playing in the WNBA, playing in the NCAA? You spoke about choice, Renee Montgomery.
Right.
How does choice play a role in a system that was built in institutionalized racism, a system that was built during Jim Crow, a system that was built right after Reconstruction? How do you find choice? How do you find freedom, particularly as Black women, when you're hyper visible and also invisible at the exact same time?
That's a word. That's a whole word. But no, I would say what athletes, and I kind of hit on it just a little bit to begin with, but athletes we're used to not saying much when it comes to anything that's a hot topic. We're used to understanding the dynamics of how a team works. The team works, and there's your coaches, then there's their bosses, and then there's owners, management, all of that. And we're just we're programmed to understand that you don't say certain things because you don't want to make the owners upset. The owners might have a sponsorship with a company that you don't like how they're moving, but you understand the team has this sponsorship, so you just kind of leave it alone. It's always been that you kind of leave it alone mentality because you understand the dynamics of how a team works. But now that word choice, that's why it's such a big deal right now. Choice is huge because athletes are kind of like, they're making the choice like, you know what, I'm going to say what I'm going to say. If you don't have a problem with it, you don't have a problem with it. Like, when have you known athletes to go head to head with the president this often? Like, that's just not a normal thing that happens. Usually athletes, we go to the White House, we smile, we take our photo, you hold up the jersey, I've done it multiple times. I was fortunate to do it with a president like Barack Obama. So to me, that was a badge of honor. I'm like, yeah, I went to the White House, I saw President Barack Obama, so that to me was a sense of pride. But we're just conditioned to understand that you're not supposed to say certain things. And now people are having a problem when athletes are moving that to the side and saying, I'm going to say something. If I see something, I'm going to say it. And that's just how it is. And now I think people just don't like that a lot of athletes are taking that choice and owning it.
Coach Kirk.
I agree. I mean, I can just go back to the beginning of what happened to George Floyd and, Breonna Taylor. And I started speaking out and I was being a little more public. And I got so many DMs and messages and text messages like, what are you doing? Like, are you afraid you're going to lose your opportunity? Like, you're already the only one we have. If you speak out, you may lose your job. And, I wasn't afraid, because I made a choice and I was doing what was right. What I was saying and what I'm fighting for is not wrong. I'm not preaching hate. I'm going against something that my grandmothers and my aunts before me fought for me to have this voice. So for me, speaking out is paying true love and care to them because they didn't have a choice. So for me not to and have an opportunity, that's very sad. And, someone in the chat brought up something very powerful that I didn't even know because I've been there I'm in Maine. It's going on my 4th year. I was 2 years with the women's staff and, it's my 5th year now. That the state that I coach in is one of the whitest states in America. you know, it's 95% white. And I guess from me just having this courage, I didn't realize that. And me speaking out, and even in my athletic department, I'm the only Black woman there. And there's only, 4 Blacks total. So I can see that the comments and everything that I received was kind of a protection. People wanted to protect me. And I think this generation of athletes are like, what do we need protection for? We're the strength, we're the voice. We understand our power, we understand our value. And for the women like me and Renee, and the women of the W, past and present, it's an empowered mindset that we have from the past, and to empower the young girls and the women of the future. So that's kind of how I feel about it.
What role, Master Metcalf, do you see these 8 athletes occupying in history? And why is it important to shed light on their story, your grandfather's story, all of the stories? Many people didn't even know that Jackie Robinson's brother, Mac Robinson, was on the Olympic team before. Facts important.
Well, first of all, how does that sound? Can you hear me a little better now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. It's interesting. I think that for the masses of people who watch these athletes perform, day in, day out, night after night, they feel a certain connection and inspiration from what they see their athletic prowess inspiring in them. So when people see an athlete do what they do best on the field or on the court or whatever their particular discipline may be, there's already a certain connectivity that occurs between these masses of people and what the athletes are doing. So that when that athlete now takes that attention and shifts it to some of these social justice issues that need that, it's extremely powerful, because you already have a captive audience. You already have somebody who you've inspired. You already have somebody who you kind of have in the palm of your hand, who enjoys what you do. So there's a real power in that. And I applaud athletes like yourselves, Anisha and Renee, for the stance that you take and using the abilities that you have in order to enlighten and raise consciousness in these ways. So I think it's quite important.
Great. Mute while I ask the question, and the feedback that they're saying that there's feedback that cuts off my question. I'm going to ask you to mute for a second while I get the next question out, if that's okay. Thank you. Coach Curry, Renee Montgomery, racialized science has played a role in sports since the very beginning. And when journalists often call games, or when they often describe athletes, they use words like beast. They use words like that are close to animalistic, that are not complimentary, or that lean more to power and strength and less to intellect and emotional skill. How do you contend with the difference in how you're covered in sports, and the difference in how African-American athletes have historically been covered by mainstream media? Those words, those names are very powerful. And how do you rise above those names and rewrite that narrative?
Yeah, I would say you own it. Right now, if somebody calls me a beast, yeah. Yeah, okay, you're right. I'm just that's what I'm gonna think. Like, now it's became so, I understand, you can understand the history of it, but now it's become to where that's almost not an insult, because now they're calling non-minorities a beast as well, in a sense. In the sports world now, a beast is, you even hear what the made the sign, I'm a savage. What? That's kind of like owning the whole persona. And I think, me being an athlete, there's so many things that derive from different things. Like, I found out recently that the master bedroom, people want to change what it's called for that reason, because it meant the master's main bedroom. So I didn't, something I didn't know. But are we all going to stop saying master bedroom? I don't really think so. It's called the master bedroom, even though if it derived from something not so great. But I don't look so deep into that because you have to hold people accountable for the now. So the shut up and dribble, that's very relevant. You know, that's very relevant because in my time as an athlete, that's what people are afraid of. That's what people don't want to see. They don't want to see these athlete activists that are igniting and uniting and focused. You know, no, that's not what people may want to see. That's what is exciting to me. So if people want to name call an activist is almost being called like a slur now, like, oh yeah, she's an activist. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I am. Like, you know, now I'm like, yeah, okay, I'm an activist then. So that's the new term, I guess, that's being used, but I'll gladly be one.
Coach Curry?
Yeah, I think that I agree. I mean, it's so many terms. It's just like with me, you know, they'll use the term, yo, trailblazer, et cetera. And I'm like, okay, I guess I'm that. But, you know, I'm owning it. And, you know, like Renee said, I'm going to own it. But I'm going to own it in a positive way. And throughout owning the verbiage, I'm going to own the narrative. And I think that's important to make sure that we're communicating our narrative. If you're going to call me an activist, I'm going to make sure I'm going to communicate to you what type of activist I am. So I'm controlling the narrative. I think in the past, you know, we didn't have enough platforms and mediums to speak, that it was only one narrative. And now we don't have that. We're really controlling the narratives around the verbiage that's spoken about us and towards us.
This narrative still disconnects with the past. How do we connect the past, the present, and the future so that there is a continuum of our history and there's a continuous record of the contributions of African-American athletes, academics, filmmakers to the fabric of America, so that when America looks at what happens now, the story is inclusive of all the voices, and it's not Renee, a Black activist in the WNBA, or Coach Curry, just, you know, separating you. How do we create the narrative so that our stories are woven in and apart? Yes, separate, because we'll always celebrate Black History Month, but integrated, so when people read the textbooks, when they watch movies, when they read articles, our treatment, the discussion of our lives and what we've contributed is fair and equal. Nasser, do you want to jump in there?
Sure. Well, I think it's important to, first of all, we can't underscore the importance of our history, and that's why the work that you're doing is so important, Deborah, because previously people have not been aware of what the achievements of athletes like the 36 Olympians, the 18 African-American Olympians in 36 games have contributed. There's so many of our heroes in our community who go unsung, so to speak. So I can't underscore the importance. I can't state enough how important it is for us to really focus on our history and understand that. Because if we understand our greatness, if we understand our power, then we will be so galvanized moving forward on all fronts, on all aspects of this struggle. So I would say that that's one of the things I would cite as one of the most important ways that we should approach it.
Fantastic, thank you.
You're welcome.
Like your grandfather. Coach Curry?
You know, I think it's important that we tell our stories while we're living. I think that's very powerful. There's a lot of powerful people doing powerful things and creating change, and our stories are not being told, whether it's media and books or history or anything. Our stories are told after we're not here. So, you know, in my movement, I always have to tell people, I am the only woman currently coaching men's basketball, but the first woman was Bernadette Maddox at the University of Kentucky.
That's
no one knew.
Coach.
Yes, I know, that's your coach. No one knew about that. And I had to constantly, when people were interviewing me, had to stop and continue to start from the beginning of my history of like, yo, I'm not, like, there were 4 women before me and I was able to tell their stories, but so much of our legacy, so much of our history is just not being told. So, you know, whether it's independent documentaries and books, we have to tell our stories to connect the past with the present, with the future.
Renee?
I would say along those same lines, be that. So why are the other stories being told? Because somebody's making it happen in a sense of there's a company behind this, and when and to Anisha's point, when there's a film behind it or a documentary behind it, now there's a trail, there's history left behind. And so now when they're writing stories and they're writing books and they remember this story that they saw, that's how the story gets in the books. You know, people write about what they know. If they don't know, they can't write about what they don't know. You know, so that's why I say a lot of HBCUs, they're in danger right now, and it's alarming because HBCUs have so much history in them, so many different like superstars, rock stars that are minorities, Black rock stars. Their history is in those schools, in those books, in those hallways, in those dormitories. So that's why I'm so passionate about education reform at HBCUs, because first of all, my family went to them, and I understand the importance of keeping that tradition, keeping that history alive. So I would say, to Anisha's point, there's HBCUs all around, you know, and there's stories in all those HBCUs. So not only telling our stories, but diving into those stories, diving into your local HBCU, helping them the same way you would help a local church. You know, like there's lots of things that HBCUs need. So I would say the way that you keep it going is you make sure that the holders of the info stays going.
I have a question for you, Renee, about HBCUs. Some of the greatest African-American athletes have come from HBCUs, but we've missed that link. We see them in their professional career, but we don't trace it back to the Gramblings and the Tennessee States, the Savannah States, et cetera. So I appreciate what you're saying in connecting those dots and looking into those archives, because our stories in many cases begin right there. They begin everywhere, but that's a very fertile ground from where they begin. When people tell your story, Renee, what do you want them to say 25 years from now, when we look back at this moment in 2020 and we look back at Renee Montgomery?
Yeah, I would hope that they're probably going to lead with that I sat out of my 2020 WNBA season. But then I hope they start to talk about how when they dove into me and the story of my life, that it actually wasn't surprising that I sat out. That would be, to me, my life would be then following and on brand and in line with what I'm doing. And I think that would be the ultimate testament, because it would show the test of time. So I hope that people don't just look at this one thing that I've done and think that it's the everything, because I had a foundation before I sat out. So, you know, like I hope that people look at the whole my life, my parents, you know, because I am my parents. So I hope they look at my parents' life and be like, whoa, her dad turned down a D1 school to go to an HBCU. And I hope they look at my mom and be like, wow, she created that whole program herself. Like I hope that people start to see that all the things that I've done is because of my sisters and, you know, my fiance, my parents. It's because of everyone around me. So I hope that is the story.
You know, Congressman Ralph Metcalfe coached at an HBCU. He coached track at Xavier in New Orleans before he became a congressman and after he became a 1936 Olympian. And I'm going to get to you in a second, Nasser. I'm going to ask Coach Curry this question. What is your story 20 years from now? What do you want people to say about you?
That I pushed the envelope, that I use my voice and my platform to push the envelope for change, and how I went about my journey of being the first woman to be a full-time Division I men's head coach, and the coaching tree that I leave behind. That's really what I want my impact to be.
And in case the mainstream press never covers your story, this video will be on YouTube for all the world to see later. Nasser, last words. Ralph Metcalfe, his story from 1932 to 1936, to his work on police brutality as a congressman, to his work convening all of the Black legislators, to his resolution for Black History Month. What does the world need to know about your grandfather and the impact of 36 that's still impacting us today in 2020?
Well, if anybody cares to do so, there's a report that my grandfather did on police brutality that's available online. And I think you can Google the Metcalfe report on police brutality. It was published, I believe, in 1974. It's 40 some odd pages, I believe, and it breaks down the narrative of what was happening in Chicago at that time with regards to police brutality and the issues that that generation was facing. If you read that, you'll see that there are some distinct parallels to what's happening today, and that as much as we have made so much progress in so many ways, there are so many things that have not changed at all, and we need to understand the importance that even though he's no longer with us, it is up to the rest of us who are here to pick up that mantle and keep moving forward with it. Now, with regards to my grandfather and his legacy and his history of achievement, as you said, you know, there's so many things that he did, so many accomplishments that he made that I think we could all draw some inspiration from. I know I certainly do, but I'm privileged to be his grandson, so I know his story, thankfully, but it's work like yours that helps others to learn about it, and I think in the process of doing that, we will find sort of our guidelines and blueprints from these people who had it much tougher than what we have out here today. They had so much more adversity, so many more obstacles to face in order to achieve the many accomplishments that they were able to achieve. So, you know, I think just learning about that and taking the time to read Olympic Pride, American Prejudice and see the film will be a great starting point.
Thank you. By the way, if you are interested in the congressional record that Ralph Metcalfe has left, including what is the most amazing recollection of police brutality in Chicago in the 70s, Dr. Cornay has put that report in the chat and you can read it. And when you read it, I read it a couple months ago and I refreshed this morning. The accounts from then read like the accounts from right now. So that difference in time didn't change it. And if you go back even further and you read the accounts from Ida B. Wells and the lynching accounts, all of this connective tissue helps us understand our history and our path, but they all our past, but they also help us forge a path to really fight constructively and strategically for equality, access, and equity. I want to thank these amazing panelists for what you bring to the table and what you've done. Your stories are powerful, your stories are incredible, and your stories will be remembered, regardless of which side of the press covers it. We're gonna make sure that these records live on. As a filmmaker, I hold myself accountable to make sure that your stories live on, the stories from 80 years ago, the stories from 800 years ago. So thank you for participating and thank you for sharing your sentiments and your very powerful stories.
Thank you for having us. Honored to be here. Thank you.
Excellent. So once again, a very warm and big thank you to Mr. Nasser Metcalfe, to Ms. Renee Montgomery, and also to Ms. Ednisha, or Coach Ednisha Curry. This was a really excellent and stimulating roundtable discussion. The chat box has just been going on and on, which is great. That's what we like to see. So I think in closing, some of the things that we've heard throughout the evening is just the power of a story. It's the power of a story. And it doesn't matter who's telling that story, but the stories need to be told. And also, I think this idea that, one thing I thought about is one critique that Black Lives Matter often gets is that it's a leaderless movement. And I think what people are confused about is that the leaders are all within us. I think, Nasser, you mentioned this, that oftentimes we're looking for that one individual, but everyone can do something. Many hands make light work. So it's not just up to one person, it's up to multiple people. I will encourage you all, I'll leave you with a little bit of homework. Since we've talked about how powerful stories are, we've talked about how powerful women are and women athletes, there's a group called the Combahee River Collective, known as CRC. There was just a write-up in the New York Times about it as well. And this is a group that was formed, I believe in the 70s. And one of their key phrases was, until Black women are free, none of us will be free. Until Black women are free, none of us will be free. And so again, I think about that video that many of us saw this week of Miss Brittany Gilliam and her daughters and nieces handcuffed on the ground over a mistaken perception about their license plate. It was an out of state license plate, and it was misconstrued as being a stolen one. That does not warrant handcuffing Miss Gilliam and her daughters and her nieces. So we've talked a lot about the public eye and the scrutiny that Black bodies in particular receive. And I'll go back to the first day. Bodies are part of people. They have a soul, they have a spirit. And I'm fortunate enough to work at Morehouse College, where we don't have to convince people about the humanity that exists within people. So I must say that this has just been so stimulating, and it reminds me so much of Dr. Martin Luther King's idea of the beloved community. And it is one in which we are a family, right? That seems like a foreign concept, but I think COVID is showing us that what happens to one happens to many. So we can't be as individualistic as we typically are. So we had a great lineup this evening. I want to thank all of the faculty members. I want to thank all of the roundtable participants. Next week is our final week. We're going to have presentations from Professor Ron Thomas, Dr. Corey Claiborne, and Dr. Wal Rice. On our roundtable next week, we're going to have Takeo Spikes, former NFL player, Olympic bobsledder Asia Evans, former mayor of Atlanta, William Campbell, and scholar Moya Bailey. So next week is going to be an even more exciting, and we're going to be wrapping up, and it's just been so nice to spend time with everyone. We hope that we've been able to give a little bit of Morehouse to you, and we just appreciate all of you being here, and hope to see you next week. So tweet us, be on the gram. I don't know what the gram is, but just interact with us in any way that you wish. And I want to thank my colleagues at Coffee Bluff Pictures, and all of you. Have a wonderful and safe evening, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.